What if I told you that the key to unlocking extraordinary mental clarity, heightened focus, and an unmatched level of productivity was not buried in complex routines, sophisticated tools, or endless self-improvement strategies? What if I told you that it's all about going without certain things? A 100-day experiment could be the key to changing how you think, work, and live, and you won't believe the transformation that happens. Imagine clearing the mental fog, sharpening your decision-making skills, and feeling sharper than you've ever felt in your entire life, all by simply stepping away from distractions, indulgences, and habits that drain your mental energy. In this video, we're going to dive deep into an experiment where a man went 100 days without release, cutting out distractions, unhealthy habits, and unnecessary indulgences. The results? His mental clarity skyrocketed, and he became more focused, more energized, and more present than ever before. But how did he do it? And what exactly happened during those 100 days? What if this experiment could hold the answers to becoming the best version of yourself? Stay with me as we explore the powerful transformation this individual experienced, and how you too could unlock extraordinary mental clarity by challenging the distractions in your own life. Trust me, this might just be the most shocking and eye-opening experiment you've heard of in a long time. Ready to find out how removing distractions can transform your mind? Let's jump in. The decision to go 100 days without release wasn't one made lightly. For many people, the idea of cutting out distractions, comfort habits, and indulgences from daily life seems almost impossible. After all, we're living in a world that thrives on constant stimulation. We scroll endlessly on our phones, binge-watch television shows, check social media notifications, and indulge in a variety of immediate pleasures to feel better. The idea of stopping all of this for 100 days sounds like a monumental challenge, right? But that's exactly what this man decided to do. Now, when we talk about release, it's important to understand what this really means in the context of the experiment. For the purposes of his 100-day challenge, release referred to a break from all the things that offered him quick fixes for his brain, those things that temporarily gave him a sense of satisfaction, but at the cost of his long-term mental clarity. This wasn't just about cutting out a particular habit, but rather about creating a completely new way of living, by removing the distractions that cluttered his mind and prevented him from reaching his full potential. At first, he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. The concept was simple, but executing it would require a level of discipline, mental toughness, and self-awareness that most people only dream of developing. He understood that the modern world was constantly pushing us to stay busy, distracted, and always looking for the next source of instant gratification. From checking your phone first thing in the morning, to the habitual evening TV binges, it's clear that much of modern life is designed to offer us quick and easy pleasure, often with little consideration for our long-term well-being. He wanted to know, what would happen if he stepped away from this constant stream of distractions? What could happen if he forced himself to stop relying on these easy pleasures and gave his brain a chance to reset? The first few days of the challenge were surprisingly difficult. One of the first things he realized was how much time and energy he had been dedicating to habits that, in hindsight, didn't really contribute to his overall goals. The first few days were filled with restlessness. He didn't realize just how often he had been checking his phone or relying on mindless entertainment. When he stopped himself from checking social media for the 10th time in a single hour, he felt uneasy. The moments when he usually reached for his phone or flipped through a TV show were now gone, and in their place was a growing sense of unease. He found himself feeling bored in a way he hadn't in years. That was the first lesson he had to learn. Discomfort was inevitable, and it was part of the process. What made this even more challenging was the fact that the world around him seemed to be moving at full speed. People were still glued to their screens, constantly sharing updates, responding to messages, and engaging in distractions. It was easy to feel left out and isolated. In the early days, it felt like he was cutting himself off from the flow of life. While others were out there enjoying their usual indulgences, he was abstaining, and the sense of missing out was palpable. It was frustrating, to say the least. But what really started to change was his understanding of why this constant need for stimulation existed in the first place. This was not just about avoiding distractions. It was about examining the role they played in his life. He began asking himself questions like, why do I feel the need to reach for my phone every few minutes? Or why do I always feel compelled to watch another episode? These simple habits of distraction were actually coping mechanisms, ways for his mind to avoid confronting deeper, more uncomfortable feelings or thoughts. These distractions had, over time, become automatic and had taken up mental space he didn't even realize was being filled. Once the first few days of discomfort passed, something strange began to happen. He realized that, without all the distractions, he was left with only his thoughts, which had initially felt overwhelming. At first it was challenging to deal with the silence, but slowly, as the noise in his life quieted down, he found that his mind became more focused, less cluttered. The endless streams of input, text messages, emails, notifications, vid shows, were no longer dominating his mental space. As he continued through this 100-day journey, he discovered that without the usual noise, he could now process thoughts more clearly. The mental fog that had clouded his mind for so long started to lift. He found himself thinking about his goals, his personal growth, and his aspirations with newfound clarity. The constant bombardment of external stimuli had kept him from fully tuning into his internal world, but now he could. The distractions had always kept him from focusing on what was truly important. Without them, his mental focus sharpened. He could sit with himself in the quiet, not needing anything outside of himself for stimulation or comfort. He was learning how to sit with his thoughts without the crutch of entertainment, work, or social media. This shift was significant, but it wasn't always easy. He learned that being free from distractions meant he had to confront his own inner battles. There were no more excuses to avoid the uncomfortable emotions, the doubts, or the fears that he had numbed for so long. For years, he had relied on distractions to avoid facing deeper, unresolved issues. Now, in their absence, those issues rose to the surface. The work of self-reflection was tough. At times, he felt raw and vulnerable, but with each passing day, he felt more self-aware and connected to his emotions than ever before. Another surprising thing happened during this period of abstinence. His ability to focus for long periods of time increased dramatically. He had always struggled with staying focused for extended hours, but without the usual distractions, he found himself able to tackle tasks that once seemed overwhelming. Whether it was work-related projects or personal endeavors, he was completing them faster, with more precision and with less mental effort. His mind wasn't jumping from one thought to the next. Instead, he could fully immerse himself in whatever task was at hand. By the time he reached the 50-day mark, something remarkable happened. He felt as though his brain had been cleaned up. The sense of calm and clarity was nothing short of extraordinary. He realized that this wasn't just about avoiding distractions, it was about reprogramming his mind to focus on what truly mattered. The clarity he had achieved wasn't just mental, it had seeped into his emotional life as well. With fewer distractions, he found it easier to connect with others in meaningful ways, and he felt more present in his relationships. In the early days, he didn't know whether the experiment would work. But as the days passed, his clarity and focus grew exponentially. This experiment had not only opened his eyes to the power of focus and intentionality, but it had also transformed his entire outlook on life. He had learned that his mind was far more powerful than he'd ever realized, and with the right level of discipline, he could break free from the endless cycle of distractions that had kept him from achieving his true potential. The first section of this journey, then, was filled with struggle, discomfort, and challenges. But it was also filled with insight, breakthroughs, and self-awareness. What started as a challenging exercise in restraint evolved into a profound transformation that changed the way he thought about his life and his future. And it was only the beginning. What he didn't realize at the time was that the results of this experiment would continue to unfold in unexpected and powerful ways in the coming days. When this man first began his 100-day journey without release, he expected some difficulty. What he didn't realize was just how challenging those early days would be, both physically and emotionally. The idea seemed simple enough. Stop engaging in all the distractions and indulgences that had cluttered his mind for years, but the reality was much harder than anticipated. In this section, we'll dive deep into what those early days felt like, how the discomfort, uncertainty, and struggle set the stage for what was to come. On day one, it seemed almost impossible. The first thing he realized was how ingrained his habits were. His usual routine consisted of jumping out of bed, reaching for his phone to check the news, emails, or social media. The first hurdle came when he told himself, no phone checking. It was only a few minutes after waking up, but it felt like an eternity. His hands instinctively reached for the device, and the pull of the habit was so strong that he had to consciously stop himself from reaching out. That simple act of taking a break from instant gratification was a wake-up call. His usual morning routine had been so embedded in his life that it was like a reflex. In the first few days, this reflex wasn't easy to control. He found himself feeling restless, with an overwhelming urge to go back to the very habits he had promised to break. But each time he resisted, the feeling of discomfort intensified. It was as though his mind was craving the usual stimulation, and the absence of it felt like a void. That's when he understood how much of his daily life had been dominated by these small, mindless actions. He hadn't realized how much mental energy was being spent on things that added no value to his life. The first day, without release, was just the beginning. Day 2, 3, and 4 brought their own sets of challenges. The anxiety of not having his usual comforts made him feel vulnerable. Each time he resisted reaching for his phone, watching TV, or indulging in some kind of instant pleasure, he felt like something was missing. His mind started wandering, asking the age-old question, why am I doing this? What's the point? The temptation to return to his old habits was strong, but he kept reminding himself of the goal. He wanted to see what would happen if he took a break from all the distractions. This feeling of unease continued into the first week. By the end of the week, he had realized just how much he relied on constant stimulation to keep himself occupied. The early struggles weren't just physical but psychological. He didn't realize how deeply these habits were tied to his sense of identity. Without the usual distractions, he felt like he had lost part of himself. What did he do when he wasn't scrolling through his phone or watching TV? How could he fill the silence that now surrounded him? This led to a period of self-reflection. The early discomfort began to transform into curiosity. Without the crutch of constant entertainment or instant fixes, he was forced to face his thoughts head-on. And what he found wasn't always pleasant. His mind, without distractions, started bringing up memories, worries, and unresolved issues. For the first time in a long time, he had to confront these feelings. He couldn't escape them. The early days without release were like an emotional detox, and it wasn't easy. He found himself questioning his past decisions, his relationships, and even his future. It was around day 10 when he started to notice his first real breakthrough. Though the struggle was still present, something subtle had shifted. The discomfort had begun to feel less like a burden and more like an opportunity for growth. As he sat with his emotions instead of running from them, he started to feel more in control of his mental state. It wasn't about eliminating discomfort altogether, but learning to sit with it, to let it pass, and to notice what it revealed. Each time he resisted the urge to indulge in his usual habits, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. It was like lifting weights for the mind, getting stronger by challenging the things that had once felt like second nature. Days 15 through 25 were particularly difficult. This was when the boredom set in. Without the usual distractions to fill his time, he found himself staring at the clock, wondering what to do next. The silence was deafening. It wasn't that he didn't have things to do, it was that without the usual distractions, it was hard to get started on anything. The first few weeks, despite all the emotional clarity, felt like a struggle to find a new rhythm. His mind, so used to instant gratification, didn't know how to handle long periods of stillness. But then something interesting happened. After a few weeks of forcing himself to sit with his discomfort, he began to crave the stillness. The mind-numbing distractions that had once ruled his life were no longer appealing. Instead, he started finding peace in quiet moments. He didn't need to check his phone every 5 minutes. He didn't need to fill his day with mindless entertainment. Slowly but surely, he began to appreciate the moments of silence. The first few days had felt like an eternity of discomfort, but now in the quiet, he started to experience a new sense of peace. This was the first indication that his challenge was starting to work. As he moved further into the 100-day experiment, the struggle began to give way to something more meaningful. It wasn't about denying himself enjoyment. It was about reclaiming his time and his focus. The more he resisted the temptation of instant gratification, the more clarity he experienced. His thoughts, which had once been cluttered with distractions, were now clear and focused. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was starting to take shape. By day 30, he had begun to notice small but significant improvements in his mental state. His ability to concentrate had increased. Tasks that once felt overwhelming were now easier to complete. The mental fog that had plagued him for years was starting to lift. And while the discomfort was still there, it had become less of an obstacle and more of a tool. The early struggles had given way to a deeper understanding of his own mind and habits. He realized that the initial discomfort wasn't a sign of failure, it was the first step in a process of transformation. In these early days, the struggle had been real. The temptation to return to old habits, to seek comfort in distractions, was overwhelming. But as he continued, he started to see that the challenge was about more than just abstaining from certain behaviors. It was about learning how to deal with discomfort, how to sit with his own thoughts, and how to reclaim his mental space. The first weeks had been difficult, but they had set the foundation for the deeper mental clarity that would follow. Now looking back, he could see that the early struggles were the key to his success. Without them, he never would have gained the clarity he now had. It was the discomfort, the restlessness, and the frustration that pushed him to the next level. Each time he faced the urge to give up, he learned something new about himself. The struggle was not an enemy. It was a catalyst for change. And while those first weeks were filled with hardship, they ultimately led to one of the most profound mental transformations of his life. After weeks of struggle and discomfort, something remarkable began to happen. The resistance that had once felt suffocating started to give way to clarity. What had initially seemed like an insurmountable challenge was now slowly becoming a powerful tool for growth. It wasn't instantaneous, and it certainly wasn't easy. But the man had finally broken through the early hurdles of his 100-day journey. It was in this section of the experiment that he began to experience the true benefits of cutting out distractions, habits, and indulgences. The first key change he noticed was how much more present he was in his day-to-day life. Without the usual distractions vying for his attention, whether it was his phone, television, or social media, he found himself paying more attention to his surroundings. He started noticing things he'd previously overlooked. The small details in his environment, like the way sunlight filtered through the window in the morning, or the scent of fresh coffee brewing, became sources of joy and mindfulness. What was once mundane now seemed rich with meaning. The act of being fully present in the moment, without the constant tug of distractions, felt like a revelation. But the most profound change occurred inside his mind. As the first weeks of struggle began to fade, the mental fog he had lived with for so long started to clear. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his mind. Without the distractions that typically filled his days, his thoughts became more coherent and sharp. Where once he struggled to focus for more than a few minutes, he now found himself able to concentrate for longer periods. He could sit down to work or engage in a task and find himself immersed in it, without the urge to check his phone or shift his attention every few minutes. The feeling of being constantly pulled in 100 different directions was gone. He was finally able to give his full attention to whatever he was doing, and that was when the true benefits of mental clarity began to show themselves. It wasn't just about focusing more, it was about how much more effectively his mind was working. His memory began to improve. He could recall facts, conversations, and ideas with greater ease. His decision-making became quicker and more confident. He started noticing patterns in his thinking that had previously been clouded by the distractions of his everyday life. His mind, once bogged down by the constant influx of external stimuli, had become a sharper, more efficient instrument. In this period of the 100-day challenge, the man also began to realize that the discomfort he had experienced in the early weeks wasn't just about resisting distractions, it was about reshaping his mental habits. As the days went on, he found himself thinking more deeply and critically. He wasn't just absorbing information, he was processing it in new ways. The absence of distractions allowed him to reflect on his goals, his values, and his future with a depth that had previously eluded him. One of the most striking changes he observed was in his emotional state. Without the constant noise and stimulation from external sources, he had more space to process his emotions. Where once he might have turned to food, social media, or other distractions to numb or avoid uncomfortable feelings, now he was forced to confront them head-on. Initially, the This felt uncomfortable, even painful. But as he pushed through that discomfort, he started to feel more emotionally resilient. The self-awareness that came with this process was unlike anything he had experienced before. He could identify his feelings more clearly, understand the root causes of his emotions, and respond to them in a healthier way. This new emotional clarity also affected his relationships. With fewer distractions, he was able to engage more deeply with the people around him. Conversations were no longer rushed or interrupted by the constant pull of his phone or other diversions. He found himself listening more attentively, connecting with others in a way that felt meaningful. He could see how his past habits of distraction had affected his interactions with others, how he had often been physically present, but mentally absent. Now he was fully engaged, emotionally available, and more open to the people in his life. As he continued this 100-day journey, the physical changes also became apparent. The man had initially assumed that cutting out distractions would only affect his mental and emotional state, but he soon noticed how his physical energy levels began to improve. Without the constant mental drain of jumping from one task to the next, he felt more energized. He could wake up in the morning feeling rested, rather than exhausted from the mental gymnastics of trying to juggle everything. His body, once weighed down by the stress and fatigue of constant overstimulation, now felt lighter and more agile. The first month of the challenge had been difficult, but as he approached the halfway point, the results were becoming undeniable. He was more focused, more aware, and more productive than he had ever been. The mental clarity he had gained didn't just stop with his own personal growth, it began to spill over into every aspect of his life. He started making decisions faster, more confidently, and with greater clarity. Work became easier. Tasks that had once felt daunting or overwhelming were now manageable and even enjoyable. He found himself accomplishing more in a shorter amount of time, and with less mental effort. Perhaps the most surprising realization he had was that the process of going without had become a habit in itself. Where at the beginning, the discomfort of abstaining from distractions had been overwhelming, now it had become second nature. The habits that once seemed impossible to break had over time been replaced by healthier, more intentional routines. He no longer felt the compulsion to check his phone every few minutes. The idea of mindlessly watching television or scrolling through social media for hours no longer held the same appeal. His daily life had become quieter, more intentional, and most importantly, more fulfilling. But the transformation wasn't just about eliminating distractions, it was about rediscovering his own sense of purpose. Without the noise and clutter of constant external input, he had rediscovered what truly mattered to him. He began to reconnect with his passions, his values, and his long-term goals. His sense of purpose, which had been clouded by the distractions of his previous life, had returned with full force. Breaking through the initial hurdles of the 100-day challenge had been a profound experience for him. What started as a struggle, an exercise in resisting temptation, had transformed into something much more powerful, a journey of self-discovery, mental clarity, and personal growth. The habits he had once thought were essential to his life were now seen as distractions that had kept him from reaching his full potential. The clarity and focus he had achieved were not just temporary benefits of the experiment, they had become permanent changes in his life. By the time he reached the halfway point, he had begun to understand that the real purpose of this experiment wasn't about simply cutting out distractions. It was about learning to be fully present in his own life, mentally, emotionally, and physically. The breakthrough moments had come slowly, but they were profound. As he moved into the next phase of his 100-day journey, he knew that the most important part of the process was already behind him. He had learned how to be more fully himself, without the distractions that had once defined his existence. In the following days, weeks, and months, he would continue to reap the rewards of this mental clarity. But the biggest lesson he had learned was that sometimes, to truly gain something, you first have to let go of what no longer serves you. As the 100-day journey continued, the man found himself moving into uncharted territory. The first weeks had been a struggle, a battle against deeply ingrained habits and mental patterns. But by the time he crossed the halfway point of the experiment, something remarkable began to unfold. What had started as an exercise in self-discipline and discomfort soon evolved into something far more profound. His mental clarity had reached levels he hadn't even imagined possible, and with it came an entirely new perspective on how he viewed his life, his habits, and his potential. In the first few weeks, it had been easy to feel like he was simply pushing through the discomfort. He wasn't sure what the final outcome would look like or whether this drastic change would truly make a difference in the long term. The early days were filled with doubts. What if this experiment didn't work? What if he couldn't last the full 100 days? But by the time he hit day 50, it was clear that something had changed for the better. The fog that had clouded his mind for years had started to lift. His thoughts were no longer scattered or disjointed. Instead, they felt sharp, clear, and more organized. The ability to focus, to think critically, and to process information with precision had improved dramatically. This was the point where he truly began to understand the power of mental clarity. Without the constant bombardment of distractions, whether from his phone, social media, or other forms of entertainment, he had created space in his mind to focus on what truly mattered. Tasks that once seemed overwhelming or draining were now tackled with ease. His brain wasn't bouncing between different thoughts, ideas, and to-do lists. Instead, he could focus on one thing at a time, giving it his full attention and seeing it through to completion. He started noticing changes in his work as well. Tasks that once took hours to complete were now done in half the time. He could sit down with a project and not feel the need to take breaks every few minutes. His productivity was through the roof. But more than just getting things done faster, he realized that the quality of his work had also improved. His mind was clearer, and as a result his decisions were more thoughtful, his creativity flowed more freely, and his output was more precise. What had once been a struggle was now an enjoyable and fulfilling task. It was as though he had unlocked a new gear in his brain, one that allowed him to operate at a higher level of focus and clarity. This wasn't just about being more productive. It was about experiencing life in a completely new way. He could think more deeply, analyze situations with greater clarity, and solve problems more effectively. Everything from work-related tasks to personal challenges was approached with a level of mental acuity he hadn't known was possible. This newfound mental clarity also spilled over into other areas of his life. He was able to have more meaningful conversations with others. Without the urge to constantly check his phone or think about other things, he could fully engage in the present moment. Whether he was talking to a colleague, a friend, or a family member, he found that his interactions were more thoughtful and connected. He wasn't distracted by external stimuli or preoccupied with the next thing he needed to do. Instead, he was fully present, listening intently, and engaging deeply. It was a shift in how he experienced the world, and it felt like a weight had been lifted. Perhaps one of the most significant changes occurred in his ability to regulate his emotions. Before starting the 100-day challenge, he had often felt overwhelmed by stress, anxiety, and the daily pressures of life. These emotions were frequently exacerbated by the constant mental clutter of modern living. But now, with his mind cleared of distractions, he noticed that his emotional reactions were more measured. He was no longer easily rattled by small frustrations or setbacks. Instead, he found himself approaching challenges with a sense of calm and clarity that he had never experienced before. For the first time in a long time, he was able to process emotions in a healthy, constructive way. He didn't feel the need to avoid difficult feelings through distractions like food, social media, or excessive work. Instead, he sat with his emotions, identified the root cause, and dealt with them head-on. This shift in emotional regulation had a profound effect on his overall sense of well-being. He felt more in control of his life, more at peace with himself, and more capable of handling the ups and downs that inevitably came his way. The mental clarity he had achieved wasn't just a fleeting moment of focus, it was a fundamental change in how he approached life. He had developed the ability to think clearly and act decisively, no longer bogged down by the constant pull of distractions or the mental fog that had once plagued him. It was as though he had removed the mental clutter, and in doing so, had created room for his true potential to shine. This clarity extended beyond just personal productivity and emotional regulation. It also had a significant impact on his long-term goals. With a clear mind and improved focus, he was able to take a step back and reassess his life's direction. What were his true passions? What were the things that mattered most to him? He had spent so much of his life distracted by external forces that he hadn't given himself the time or space to explore these fundamental questions. But now, with his mind free from the noise, he was able to reconnect with his core values and begin to build a vision for his future that was authentic and aligned with his true self. As he reached the 75-day mark, the benefits of the challenge were undeniable. His mental clarity had become a powerful tool for self-improvement. But it wasn't just about achieving personal success. It was about living a more intentional life. He had become more aware of the choices he was making, more focused on his goals, and more present in his relationships. The distractions that had once controlled his time and energy no longer had the same hold on him. In many ways, this period marked the peak of his transformation. It wasn't just about what he was accomplishing, it was about who he was becoming. His mindset had shifted from one of constant busyness and mental clutter to one of clarity, purpose, and presence. He had learned to be intentional with his time, energy, and thoughts. And as he looked ahead to the final stretch of the 100-day challenge, he knew that the mental clarity he had gained would continue to serve him long after the experiment was over. The changes he had experienced were profound, and they weren't just surface-level improvements. They had affected his core being, his mindset, his emotional state, and his overall approach to life. By eliminating distractions, he had created space for his mind to flourish. What had started as a challenging experiment had become a life-changing journey. The mental clarity he had unlocked wasn't just a temporary benefit, it had become a new way of living. As he neared the end of the 100-day journey, he realized that this challenge had revealed something even more important: the power of simplicity. In a world that constantly demands more of our attention and energy, the ability to simplify and focus on what truly matters was perhaps the greatest gift he could give himself. The mental clarity he had gained wasn't just about clearing his mind for the sake of productivity, it was about clearing the path for a more meaningful, intentional life. And that, he realized, was worth more than anything he could have imagined. As the 100-day experiment continued, the benefits of this mental detox began to snowball. The early stages were marked by discomfort, frustration, and a battle to resist the urge to go back to old habits. But now, as he entered the final stretch of his journey, the rewards of the experiment became undeniable. His focus had sharpened, his productivity had skyrocketed, and his ability to get things done with precision had reached new heights. This section will explore how the absence of distractions transformed his ability to focus and work more effectively than ever before. In the first few weeks of the challenge, he struggled to focus for long periods. His mind was so used to the constant bombardment of distractions, whether from his phone, social media, or constant notifications, that it had become almost impossible to concentrate. It felt like his brain was constantly jumping from one thought to another, never settling on any one thing for too long. But as the experiment progressed, something extraordinary happened. His ability to focus for extended periods began to improve dramatically. The absence of distractions created a new mental landscape. With no immediate gratification to fall back on, he was forced to confront his thoughts and fully engage with the tasks at hand. Instead of multitasking or jumping between different activities, he began to develop the ability to immerse himself completely in one thing at a time. Whether he was working on a project, reading a book, or having a conversation, his mind was fully present in that moment, without the urge to check his phone or worry about what was happening elsewhere. This shift in focus didn't just improve his efficiency, it also enhanced the quality of his work. Before the experiment, he often found himself rushing through tasks, trying to get as much done as possible in the shortest amount of time. But with his newfound ability to focus, he started paying more attention to detail. His work became more thoughtful, more intentional, and more impactful. Whether he was writing, planning, or creating, he could approach each task with a level of depth and precision that had previously eluded him. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when he realized that his productivity was no longer dictated by the amount of time he spent working, but by the quality of his focus. In the past, he had equated long hours at his desk with productivity, but now he discovered that he could accomplish in a few focused hours what would have once taken him an entire day. His mind was clearer, his energy was more concentrated, and he no longer felt drained by the endless cycle of distractions. The simple act of sitting down to work became a more fulfilling experience, and the results spoke for themselves. Another unexpected benefit of this heightened focus was that he was able to make faster, more effective decisions. In the past, he often found himself paralyzed by indecision, constantly second-guessing himself and overthinking every choice. But as his mind became clearer, he was able to trust his instincts and make decisions with confidence. Whether it was in his personal life, work, or long-term goals, he found that his decision-making process had become faster and more intuitive. The mental fog that had once clouded his judgment had been lifted, and in its place was a sense of clarity and confidence. But perhaps the most profound change was his ability to embrace deep work, those long, uninterrupted stretches of time when he could fully immerse himself in a task. Before the experiment, deep work had been a foreign concept. He was so accustomed to constant interruptions and distractions that he had never been able to experience true focus for extended periods. But now, with the distractions gone, he found that he could engage in deep work for hours at a time, producing his best work and achieving a level of flow that was both exhilarating and deeply satisfying. This newfound ability to focus also had a profound impact on his personal growth. In the past, he had struggled to find time for self-improvement or personal development. Between work, social media, and other distractions, he had never felt like he had the mental bandwidth to invest in himself. But now, with his mind free from the clutter of distractions, he found himself devoting more time to reading, learning, and developing new skills. His personal growth accelerated, and he found himself more motivated than ever to pursue his passions and goals. The experiment had also allowed him to rediscover the joy of working without constant interruptions. In a world that is always on, where notifications, emails, and messages are never ending, the ability to work without being constantly pulled away felt like a gift. He was no longer checking his phone every few minutes, worrying about what he might be missing. Instead, he was fully immersed in his work, able to tackle each project with an unparalleled level of focus. The work that once felt overwhelming now felt like a natural part of his routine, something he could handle with ease and efficiency. This period of intense focus and productivity was not just about getting more done, it was about redefining what it meant to work with intention. The man realized that the way he had been working before was inefficient, fragmented, and unproductive. His mind had been scattered, jumping between tasks and distractions, unable to settle on anything for too long. But by eliminating distractions and cultivating the ability to focus deeply, he had unlocked a new level of productivity that was both fulfilling and sustainable. As he continued his 100-day journey, he found that his work became more enjoyable. The pressure and stress that had once been a constant companion were replaced by a sense of purpose and fulfillment. He no longer had to force himself to work. Instead, he approached his tasks with enthusiasm and energy. The absence of distractions had allowed him to reconnect with the joy of creating, producing, and engaging with his work in a way that he had not experienced in years. By the time he reached the final stretch of the 100 days, the transformation was undeniable. His focus, productivity, and overall mental clarity had improved exponentially. He had become more disciplined, more intentional, and more present in all aspects of his life. What began as a challenge to remove distractions had blossomed into a profound journey of self-discovery and personal growth. The experiment had not only reshaped his daily routines, but it also redefined his approach to life itself. He realized that his ability to focus and work with intention was the key to unlocking his full potential. In a world that constantly pulls our attention in 1,000 different directions, learning to focus deeply on what truly matters had become the most valuable skill he could cultivate. As the 100 days drew to a close, he knew that this journey had changed him forever. The mental clarity, focus, and productivity he had gained would continue to serve him long after the experiment was over. But more than that, he had learned the importance of intentionality in every area of his life. The distractions that had once ruled him no longer had the same power. His mind was his own, and he was in control of how he spent his time and energy. And in that control, he had found a new sense of freedom. By the time the man reached day 80 of his 100-day experiment, the journey had already transformed his mind in profound ways. What began as an experiment in eliminating distractions and cutting out unhealthy habits had evolved into something far more intricate and revealing. The changes weren't just limited to his mental clarity, focus, and productivity. They also had a deep emotional impact. As the days wore on, he found that he wasn't just learning how to focus more intently or work more efficiently. He was also learning how to better manage his emotions, confront his vulnerabilities, and understand himself in ways he never had before. However, As his mental landscape became clearer, the emotional challenges grew stronger. The silence he'd created through the absence of distractions became a double-edged sword, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his life. One of the most surprising aspects of the experiment was the way it began to challenge his emotional resilience. In the early weeks, the struggle had been external, resisting the pull of the phone, the TV, the social media notifications, and all the instant gratifications that had cluttered his life. But by the time he entered the final stages of the 100-day challenge, the battle had shifted inward. Without the usual distractions to mask his feelings, he was left alone with his thoughts. And sometimes, those thoughts weren't easy to face. In the quiet, he began to recognize patterns of emotional avoidance that had been present in his life for years. Like many people, he had developed coping mechanisms to deal with difficult emotions. Whether it was turning to his phone for comfort, watching TV to numb his feelings, or even burying himself in work to avoid confronting his deeper insecurities. These were ways of escaping the discomfort of facing unresolved issues or emotions. But without the crutch of distractions, he had no choice but to sit with those feelings, to confront them head-on. At first, this was deeply uncomfortable. There were moments when he felt overwhelmed by the emotions he had been avoiding for so long. Whether it was the guilt from past mistakes, anxiety about the future, or lingering doubts about his own worth, the absence of distractions left him vulnerable. For a while, he struggled to understand how to process these emotions. He found himself questioning whether the experiment was even worth it, wondering if he had opened up a can of worms that he wasn't prepared to handle. But as the days went by, he realized that this emotional discomfort was actually a gift. The experiment had forced him to stop running from his feelings, to stop numbing himself with distractions. He was now learning to acknowledge his emotions without judgment, to feel them fully, and to process them in a healthier way. The silence that had once felt like a void now became a space for emotional healing. Slowly, he began to develop a greater sense of self-awareness and emotional intelligence. In this period of emotional growth, he also began to understand the importance of self-compassion. The early days of the experiment had been filled with a sense of self-criticism. He often found himself frustrated with his inability to fully embrace the challenge, or angry at himself for slipping into old habits. But as time went on, he learned to be kinder to himself. He recognized that emotional growth wasn't a linear process. There would be setbacks, difficult days, and moments of doubt. But that didn't mean he was failing. It meant he was human. This new understanding allowed him to approach his emotional challenges with patience rather than self-criticism. One of the key breakthroughs came when he started to separate himself from his emotions. In the past, he had often defined himself by how he felt at any given moment. If he was anxious, he saw himself as an anxious person. If he was sad, he saw himself as a failure. But through the practice of sitting with his emotions and reflecting on them, he began to see them as temporary states that didn't define his identity. His feelings were a part of him, but they weren't all of him. This shift in perspective helped him regain a sense of control over his emotional world, rather than feeling at the mercy of whatever emotions happened to arise. During this emotional growth phase, he also recognized how much his emotional state affected his physical health. In the past, he had experienced periods of high stress that led to physical exhaustion, poor sleep, and a general sense of fatigue. But as he learned to process his emotions in a healthier way, he noticed a significant improvement in his physical well-being. Stress didn't have the same grip on him anymore, and his energy levels began to stabilize. He realized that emotional clarity and mental well-being weren't just linked to productivity, they were linked to overall health. The more he managed his emotional life, the better his body felt. However, emotional growth didn't come without its setbacks. There were days when the silence and the lack of distractions felt too overwhelming. He sometimes found himself longing for the comfort of his old habits. The temptation to slip back into old patterns, checking his phone, watching endless hours of TV, or diving into work, was still there. The process of emotional healing was challenging because it often meant facing uncomfortable emotions that he had spent years avoiding. But with each struggle, he became more resilient. He learned how to sit with discomfort, how to allow feelings to come and go without being consumed by them. A significant shift occurred when he began to recognize the emotional freedom that came with the absence of distractions. In the past, he had always turned to something external for comfort, whether it was technology, food, or other forms of escape. But now, in the silence, he realized that true emotional freedom came from within. It wasn't about avoiding negative emotions, it was about embracing them, feeling them, and letting them pass. He learned that emotional resilience wasn't about being happy all the time. It was about being able to handle whatever came his way with grace and strength. By the time he reached day 90, he had gained a deeper understanding of himself than he had ever had before. His emotional world felt more stable, more balanced. He wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, anxiety, and frustration. But he had developed the tools to manage those emotions without letting them control him. He had learned that emotional growth was a continuous process, one that required patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to face discomfort head-on. The final stretch of the 100-day challenge wasn't as much about new insights or revelations. It was about solidifying the growth he had already experienced. By this point, he had gained a sense of emotional clarity that allowed him to move through life with a greater sense of ease. He no longer felt like his emotions controlled him. Instead, he had become the observer of his feelings, able to process them in a way that was empowering rather than overwhelming. As he neared the end of the experiment, he realized that this journey had been about much more than just cutting out distractions. It had been about learning to understand himself in a way that was deeply personal and transformative. The emotional growth he had experienced was just as important, if not more so, than the mental clarity and productivity gains. Through this experiment, he had not only unlocked a new level of focus and productivity, but he had also unlocked a new level of emotional intelligence and resilience. And that, he realized, was the true value of the 100-day journey. As the 100-day journey came to a close, the man found himself reflecting on everything he had learned, experienced, and overcome. What started as a simple experiment to break free from the endless cycle of distractions had turned into a life-altering transformation. Looking back, it wasn't just about what he had gained in terms of mental clarity, focus, and productivity. It was about the profound emotional growth he had experienced. The challenge had not only reshaped his relationship with time, but also with himself. He had broken free from the shackles of constant distraction, and in doing so, had unlocked a version of himself that was more present, more intentional, and more connected to his true purpose. The mental clarity he gained was undeniable. His ability to focus, concentrate, and engage with life in a way that felt purposeful and fulfilling was something he had never truly experienced before. He had redefined what productivity meant, not just in terms of getting more done, but in doing things with intention, presence, and depth. Every task, every conversation, and every moment was infused with a new level of meaning. He realized that it wasn't the number of tasks he completed that mattered. It was how deeply he engaged with each one. But the most profound shift came in his emotional world. At the start of the challenge, he had no idea how much emotional growth he would experience. With all the distractions removed, he was forced to confront his emotions, face his fears, and understand himself in ways he had been avoiding for years. The early days had been uncomfortable, even painful, but as he worked through those emotions, he realized they were no longer something to be feared. They were a powerful source of self-awareness and growth. He discovered that emotional resilience wasn't about avoiding negative feelings, but learning how to sit with them, understand them, and move forward. What stood out most to him by the end of this journey was the power of simplicity. In a world that constantly demands our attention and energy, stripping away the unnecessary had given him the space to reconnect with what truly mattered. He didn't need all the distractions to feel fulfilled or purposeful. The silence, which had initially been uncomfortable, had become a place of deep reflection, growth, and peace. Through that space, he had rediscovered his true self, the version of himself that was present, calm, and focused. As the 100 days came to an end, he realized that this experiment wasn't just about eliminating distractions. It was about reclaiming control over his life, his time, his energy, and his attention. It was about choosing how he wanted to live, rather than being at the mercy of the constant pull of modern life. The clarity, focus, and emotional growth he had gained weren't temporary. They had become a permanent part of who he was. The 100 days had taught him that true freedom comes from within, from the ability to choose where to direct your energy and attention, and from the power of being fully present in your own life. Now, as he looked ahead, He knew that he would never go back to the way things were before. The changes he had made in his life were too valuable to ignore. He had learned to listen to himself, to value his time, and to engage with the world in a way that felt true to who he was. The journey wasn't easy, but it had been worth it, and as he moved forward, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had unlocked a new level of self-awareness, mental clarity, and emotional strength that would guide him for the rest of his life. The journey had ended, but the lessons, the growth, and the transformation would last a lifetime.